Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to call today's meeting to order of the Policy Committee, and we have Policy Committee meetings members who are here today. Director DePass, who's here, and Director Sullivan, who's online, in addition to Student Rep JJ. And we also have, looks like Director Wong joining us today as well. And I can't see because of the caption whether there's anybody else, but is that the limit? Okay. So for today's agenda, the primary agenda item will be our cell phone use policy. In addition, we will have a brief discussion about a new topic, the ethics and conflict of interest policy. We'll have a policy for potential rescission that's been suggested by staff. And then we also have on the agenda, although I don't anticipate action, a policy that's out for public comment, which is the field trips, foreign travel, and other off-campus activities. We're going to start today with public comment and then go right into the cell phone use policy. So, Ms. Bradshaw, do we have anybody signed up to testify?
We do. We have Ian Ritorto.
Sorry, I'm keeping it. It's okay.
Hello. All right. Thank you all. Am I good to go?
Yeah. Can you start by sharing your name and how to spell your last name, and then you have 2 minutes.
All right. Hello. My name is Ian Ritorto, and I'm a student at Roosevelt High School. I believe that the off and away policy is the most effective way to handle phones. Firstly, I'd like to talk about enforcement and viability. To enforce something like an all-day phone ban would require a large amount of resources and would be ineffective. Yonder pouches are extremely expensive, and even if the schools came up with an alternative system where they would check phones at the front doors, it would require both substantial physical resources to safely hold phones and human resources to get everyone's phones back to the right people. Just imagine the logistical nightmare. Additionally, we've seen at schools who've implemented Yonder pouches that most kids will just say, "Oh, I didn't bring my phone today," or "I don't have one," rendering the system completely useless. However, notably, at these schools, you still won't see phones out. This is because it is ultimately an issue of enforcement. The phones stay away because kids don't want a referral, so that's all you really need. Secondly, I'd like to talk about passing periods and lunch. It would be all but impossible to enforce a phone ban during passing periods, on top of being mostly pointless. However, a lunch ban could be loosely enforced, but it would be a bad idea. Many students go off campus for lunch, and no phones would be an enormous safety hazard. Additionally, lunch is the 30 minutes kids get every day to themselves, and maybe you're of the opinion that kids should be forced to interact with each other, but I think that this is a major infringement on the freedom of kids. These are high schoolers we're dealing with, and they should be treated with a degree of respect that their age warrants. Lastly, I'd like to bring the educational use of phones and why it needs to be up to teacher discretion. In my leadership class, phones are an integral part of our classwork, and we need to film TikToks, film clips for our announcements, and many other things. In some classes, phones are very useful, which is why it needs to ultimately be up to teachers, because they know what's right for their classes. We simply need to support teachers in their decision. Today, a teacher who had previously been pretty lax on phones came back from a break and said, "I've changed my mind on phones, and I'll give you a referral if I see one out." I didn't see a single phone out all day. An off and away policy with admin support and room for teacher discretion is not only the most effective policy, but the most feasible as well. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much for coming and presenting. And wow, very timely. Thank you.
That's everybody signed up.
Okay. So I have given committee members a heads up that we have had this policy draft before the committee and under discussion by the board since I believe last spring we started, and kind of stretching into through the summer. We've had a student survey, which I want to thank JJ for working on that with Dr. Adams, where we received a fair amount of student feedback, also roundtables with the students at Cleveland and also Grant. We also received a fair amount of teacher feedback through a couple schools that put together sort of school-based surveys. I think we've all also received a fair amount of feedback from parents, just informally and anecdotally. We've had presentations from principals from the schools that both have policies and or have enforcement tools, and also from the alternative programs. And we've had several full board discussions about it, since this is a topic that has been of interest not just to the committee members, but for the full board. And most recently, we had a full board session and to talk about some of the key elements, and individual committee members and also board members submitted what they believed would be the sort of essential elements of a policy. And based on that, we have a policy draft that has been posted that in most elements, I believe reflects what I heard to be perhaps a majority consensus, with one or two areas where it wasn't clear, because not everyone had weighed in. But I think on most of the essential elements that the draft before us today contains what I thought I heard was the majority point of view, and also taking into account the student feedback. And at the last meeting, one of the areas in which there was a variety of opinions, and I want to recognize that there is from a very there's a sort of point of view that's very restrictive to a less restrictive, and it's on a spectrum. And one of the areas was around sort of off and away during the entire school day, or whether sort of lunch and passing periods. And what I thought what I felt was not that it wasn't the consensus, it was maybe the majority, was that for sure off and away during class time, but not at lunchtime. And we also said, because there was a variety of opinions, that we would ask for sort of the superintendent and central office's staff's point of view. So I don't know, John, if you're sitting there because you're about ready to deliver that staff point of view, but you could. And there also so we have a staff memo that's been posted with what I think is representative of the superintendent's and the senior staff's point of view, and also not just on the sort of lunchtime, but also a couple other items. So why don't you go ahead and present?
No, thank you. And just want to reiterate, too, that Dr. Armstrong is in support of the suggested amendments. But I can proceed however you like. If you want me to summarize the amendments, or
so there actually aren't amendments. They would be, so we have a draft, and unless a majority of the board wanted to move ahead, and somebody wanted to offer them, they're
got it. Okay, so I think from there are a few things at play here, and you said them perfectly. It's the pieces around capacity, and so we absolutely agree. And this varies according to level, and so elementary and middle, From an enforcement perspective, off and away just by level, right? Across the board. That includes lunchtime, anything along those lines. Just from an enforcement perspective, it's more doable. Okay, when we get to the high school, it's different because they do have capacity to go off campus. We know our high schools are, in a sense, little cities with a lot of places where you essentially can go. We absolutely, in the classroom, no question about it. To me, that's not the issue. It is passing time and it's lunch, right? And our thinking was, unless we incorporate, say, a resource like a Yonder pouch, where kids are checking them in and they're placed in a safe space, and they can't access their phone in any way, backpack or anything like that, from a capacity perspective, that's going to be very difficult, right? And because they go off campus for lunch, it makes it even harder. So that's kind of in summary. And then there are pieces around like taking pictures without permission. Again, if you think specifically, unless we have the kids check their phones in and they don't have access at all, yes, that makes sense. But because, unless, again, resource, and I did include some costs in terms of options that we could apply, that'll be really difficult to do as well. And I did include as well, hopefully you did receive that. So we looked at 3 basic devices that are being used now, and that's Yonder, as we know. And you can see the cost associated, because right now, obviously, we're just thinking about middle school and high school. The locker box, the aluminum, so that's in a sense we would put, in classrooms. They come in, packs, or I should say a number quantity per case. So the idea is they'd be in each classroom. Student would go in, check their phone in there. They wouldn't have access to it at all, so you wouldn't necessarily have issues, if kids left the classroom, kind of that type of thing. But the students would then check out the phones after they left class. And then the last piece are the ones, kind of the caddies that you see on classroom doors or on walls, where it's a pocket, right, where they would go in a sense, kind of checking in their phone as well. Same concept. That's obviously not as secure, right, as the locker boxes, but it is an opportunity where, you would not have the level of issue, right, during class time. So that's kind of in summary what we offered as points we need to discuss. Yeah.
I wanted to bring up that Director Wong has submitted, it was a little bit late, a draft. It's in board book. Looks like it was loaded in. And then also Director Sullivan has lost her voice, and so she would like me or anyone to read her statement. So before we go down the road much further.
Great.
Okay, well, I want to finish with the superintendent. Because I can't, here, I can make it larger. So just so I understand, is how what this looks like is that for 6 to 12 grades combined, going with something like, and let's just be clear, the board's role is not on the implementation. So this is more for just us to understand. And we certainly wouldn't put something that had a budgetary impact in policy. That's just would be decided during the budget process. But just by comparison, something like the Yonder pouches, 725,000 versus
725,000.
725,000 versus the lockbox, which is 34,000, and then this is the pocket chart. Is that more like the calculator caddy?
Correct.
That, at 8,000 and 64 cents.
Just want to be clear.
To be precise.
Clarity's kind.
And again, the board, because what the board's role is, we describe the what, and the staff does the how. But I think it's worth noting that the variety of solutions have a variety of different costs.
Right.
So I'd like to ask And I think, Director Sullivan, you could maybe text or email your questions, but does anybody have any questions for Dr. Franco about the staff's position?
I don't have any questions, no.
Yeah, I think my question was, is staff planning on implementing like one of these phone storage to when we implement the policy, or?
Well, obviously cost plays in, I mean, we'll have to look at those types of things, right? And so I'll have to take it back to the team ultimately to decide.
I think it depends on where we land.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. You said it perfectly, Director DePass.
Director Wong or Sullivan, do you have questions about the staff position? Which I think I would summarize. The position is that you would support in the current draft the students having access during lunchtime, but not the provision that has sort of the off and away during passing time.
Correct.
And that you would suggest that we strike 2E, which is students may not take photographs or videos of other students or staff during the school day without their verbal permission.
Correct.
So from my perspective, at least on, so I'll share. I would like to better understand why staff wouldn't want to have in the policy that students may not take photographs or videos of other students or staff during the school day without their permission. Just we have a policy like adults and the media can't take pictures of students and use them, and so I'm curious why we'd have a different policy, or just want to have the public discussion about why we'd have a different policy for our students, because from my experience, there is, unauthorized taking pictures of other students or staff and then using them in ways that are unkind, or in ways in which the individual being photographed wouldn't want it to be used. So I'm just curious about.
Yeah, no, I appreciate the question. So, so if we cannot, again, coming back to the Yonder pouches, right? If we can't basically have a way where kids, it's a rule or it's a policy, a school policy with support from a resource such as Yonder pouches. Like, for example, if we just say, we could do some things via the classroom, so we know they're checking in their phones during class, but as soon as they leave, right, because that's a little more difficult to monitor, and if kids have access to their phones, I mean, I think, for, passing time and those types of things, I totally agree in regards to, and it's in the student rights and responsibilities in terms of if they're using them to bully or that type of thing, that's covered in student rights and responsibilities. But I also look at things like, it may not be purposeful, right? You have all these kids running around, and a picture's taken, and you have, the kids in the background, they just didn't know about it. And then I think the capacity to enforce consequence during something like that is really going to be a stretch for our building administrators.
What about changing may to should? Like, it's setting an expectation versus saying you can't do it. I mean, from my perspective, it's setting an expectation.
Yeah.
If we don't set expectations, then I think maybe students might not understand what we expect of them.
Well,
I mean, we're very clear with adults.
I don't disagree. I guess what I'm looking at is the practicality when you're talking about high schools in particular, and the level of things that can happen are just inadvertent. No, not being, how can I say it? I mean, you're not not intentional about those types of things. Kids could just be having fun with their friend group. Pictures are taken. Another student walks in the background. I'm just bringing up scenarios. Mistakenly gets photographed, and then, that student can then say, okay, here's this part of the policy, and then would go to the building administrator. Again, no intent from this team, and then the student in question, there was no intent, but then could come back and say, I don't want to be photographed, right? And I think that's kind of the piece that we're running against here. And then back to the point about just enforcement, like we could spend, I know building leaders could spend an inordinate amount of time on this. And there is, again, pieces that we feel are covered within student rights and responsibilities. If there's distinct intent, taking a picture or a video, intent to bully, intent to harass, like that will be dealt with absolutely.
I think from just a drafting perspective, should is an awkward term for what should happen. There's certainly a point of view about what the board would like to see, but that is not clear to district administrators or students and parents what will happen if there are pictures taken where someone's inadvertently. So it's an awkward way to draft an expectation that doesn't have enforcement. I think it'll be interpreted differently by different audiences. I would also say that the requirement for adults is for employees of the district. I mean, it's district action. Students taking pictures in a hallway is not district action. So that's a distinction that as to why and how.
There's
it may
media
not-
requirements too.
It's an opt-out too. So it's a consent, I'm sorry. In that it's consent is presumed unless parents specifically opt out for the media thing. So, for example, when there are football games, it's that show up in the paper the next day. The assumption is that those photographers may take pictures of student unless they have been informed. Again, there has to be knowledge, right? So the coaches or the administrators know what families have opted out of allowing consent. That may not be true for students. Students wouldn't be able to know that information.
So staff's position would be that the first bullet point would cover that case where a student took a picture of another student or of a staff member and used it in an unkind or mocking way, and what would be what are the repercussions? What does our policy say the repercussions are?
So we have a.
I can look it up, but I'm sure that you can.
We
tell
have
me.
a specific policy on harassment and cyberbullying, and this would be under cyberbullying, right? So you're taking a photo of someone to deliberately harass or embarrass them. And if you look at, it's hard for me to give a hard and fast because the matrix looks at a number of different things, right? So is it the first time it's done? You look at the age of the child. You look at there are a lot of considerations you take into account when you're looking at a consequence for the child. Is it a repeat time? Then it becomes, you go from a level 1, for example, it could be a referral, and there could be some repair that's done, to more serious things where it could go up to and including suspension or in some cases expulsion, right? So it really does depend on the degree of harm, the impact on the student. It also depends on the student who has done it, what factors you're looking at. Is this their first or their second, or is this an ongoing, what we would call in kind of civil rights world a pervasive or a persistent act, right? So it has different consequences.
Okay. Director Wong, I have a question. Were you going to weigh in on this topic or a different topic?
This topic.
This one, okay. Because I'm going to say I'm willing to, I'd be open to taking it out of the policy, but the staff report being really specific about what, at least for me, and of course I would want to know what there'd have to be committee agreement to move it out, but that I would want in the staff report some really clear, like, what are the ramifications, because if I were reading this, I wouldn't necessarily come to the conclusion that it covers all the things that have been described. Director Wong.
Yeah, thank you. And Dr. Franco, I'm always very appreciative of your input and what you have to share. It's always so helpful. So a couple of responses to that. From hearing this issue about unable to enforce the photo taking, bullying, harassment, it almost seems like that's an argument for off and away all day. I'm just saying. But I'm curious to hear your response to this. The other thing is also, in response to this, one of the edits that I put in to address the issue about, for high school, a lot of students take lunch off campus, is to add the language that says that the rule applies for, off and away during the school day, and the thing I added was on campus, and I think that would automatically mean that if you leave campus, you can take your phone with you and all. So because honestly, it isn't up to PPS's. It's not PPS's job to enforce off-campus phone use. The other thing I also want to be kind of wary about is this issue of enforcement. Like, one of the things about enforcement is that it's kind of a two-way street. Like, to give you an example, so like not knowing how to enforce it now at this moment shouldn't be guiding what would be good policy and best practices for our students. And the example I give to that is something like speed limits. Like, there's no way Portland police can enforce every speed limit in the whole city, and that doesn't mean we shouldn't have speed limits, because when someone does speed, it gives an ability to enforce. So if we have, like, for example, off and away, yeah, we may not be able to enforce it during passing time or during lunch, but if an infringement happens or bullying happens or people are taking out their phones and abusing it, and that happens, then we have a policy where we can use to enforce. And I think I just want to be wary, even though I do value and understand that this is a very complicated issue, and the idea of how to implement it is going to be very difficult. We have some of the best and brightest in PPS, so I think my whole thing is that not knowing how to enforce it now, I want to be careful about using that as something to shape what we are considering as policy. Anyways, curious about what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, great thoughts. To me, it does come down to, resource to an extent, right? Like, the good thing about the Yonder pouches, right, is that they check them in. There's a place for them, and then kids check them out. So it's kind of a forced piece, right? So just that in itself, but unless if we can't supply the resource to assist with that, then it's just a lot harder. We absolutely have control within the classroom, but even during passing time or lunch, the kids will have them. And so I'm just saying that's really hard to do from a practicality standpoint. And if you talk to, aside from, Grant or Cleveland or Beaumont Middle School, you talk to them, they'll specifically say that Yonder pouches have made a significant difference. The problem is it's going to cost a lot of money.
I have a comment about that. So, Director Wong, you said, and I agree, that the staff memo seems to be supportive of an off and away during lunchtime for the reasons that you stated. It's hard to enforce, and which I would be supportive of. I then wonder about if students are able to use their phones at lunchtime if they leave the campus. Does that create inequitable access for kids that cannot afford to have lunch off campus? Or are they so into the phones that would serve as lunch?
Well, literally, you just cross the street. I actually don't. My understanding was the staff position, the superintendent and staff position was to allow students to have them at lunchtime and passing time.
Correct. And two, I know that, because it was, sorry, did you have?
I just want to make sure that.
Yes, that's correct. And I know there was a piece too that's been discussed at length here, is like, we don't want to put teachers in a place where they're always having to do this piece in terms of enforcement And I would say, right, is that teachers generally aren't in the hallways during passing time. So you distinctly would have administrators, campus supervisors to that extent. And again, it just comes back to capacity. It's not that I don't agree with certain things, but I want to be practical on what we can actually do. And if we put something in play, then it's just going to, I'm just telling you, it's going to really be tough, especially if we don't have like a Yonder pouch to support it.
Again, it seems like that's a good argument for not having access during passing periods. But we also heard from principals that testified that said that's when you see behaviors that we don't want to encourage during passing and lunch. So there's two reasons now. It's when the bad behavior happens that we don't want to encourage from our students, and it's also difficult to enforce.
That's correct. So are you?
It would seem best to me to have an off and away all day, which would also be difficult to enforce. I mean, no matter what happens, it's going to be, we're going to have some enforcement or some consequences.
No question. And
no matter what.
Correct. Absolutely. No matter what. So I think the, obviously during class, if they have to use the restroom, they're not going to be using their phone, they're not going to have access to it, because there'll be pieces, like even if we do the caddy, right, which was $8,024, right?
$8,060.24.
Okay, that's great.
Approximately.
So, so that can be a piece, absolutely, where we can, again, financially, that seems very reasonable. But they're getting their phones afterwards. And so the reality is they're going to be on their phones during passing time. And so I would absolutely expect, because we could still do something. I will expect every school, because of the support, of a policy like this, there's immense effort and focus in terms of education first and foremost, but then enforcement, right? But it is a cause for pause at any time you have unstructured space during passing time, and we don't have, again, that resource. It's just going to be extremely difficult to do.
I'm also looking at the math on this. So on the Yonder pouches, 6 to 12 combined, 725,700 divided by, I don't know how many students we have in those grades.
Yeah, so there is,
the total district school kids.
For the Yonder pouches?
Yeah, I mean, if I just did 725,700 divided by 44,000, and it comes up to like $164 per unit.
Yeah. So I'll have to.
It's just a math. I mean, it's a math question.
Yeah. Here.
That if we know how many students we have in grades 6 to 12. Times the $30 per unit.
Sorry, I don't want to give you false numbers. Can I rip up my calculator here?
23,000, 24,000 times $30 per unit.
I guess the question I would have is, it seems like there may be an incentive. I'm not sure what the difference is between students having their phones when they're off campus for lunchtime or on campus for lunchtime. I mean, to me, it's like, why are we making the distinction? I actually think we might incentivize students to want to leave campus to use their phones. I mean, I can tell you some pretty predictable behavior, which would be, I want to use my phone. The only way they tell me I can use it at lunchtime is to get off campus. And I feel like the fact that we are able to supply lunch to most of our students now on campus, and that there is, I mean, I used to call my kids like, nothing good happens off campus at lunch. I knew that was true for me when I was in high school. And so I think it's a curious thing to make that distinction of like, it's okay to use it off campus, but you couldn't use it while you're on campus at lunchtime. And so, to me, what I thought I heard was from the majority of the board was that definite, like very strong support, like off and away, and using also your description that you provided, Director Wong, during class time, because that's the moment, the most important moment when we're wanting instruction and what the teachers were most concerned about. And I think that policy does that. And we also, it seemed like there was very clear, like nobody thought that middle school students needed to have their phones during the day. But I don't think there was clarity of like, we don't think students should have access to their phone during lunchtime. And to me, unless we decide to close our campuses, which, just for the record, if anybody's listening, I'm not proposing that. I don't need to hear from all the high schoolers in Portland. But I think if our students are going to be out in the community, I think it's not at all unreasonable that they would have access to their phone. And I can't see, I think there'll be all sorts of workarounds happening if they don't.
Yeah, and I know the district student council is definitely in support of having phones off campus, because, you know, as I brought up last meeting, just the safety concerns, especially for students at McDaniel, Lincoln, Jefferson, and Roosevelt. There's lots of safety issues outside of their schools, so just many students feel safe with having their phones when they go off campus.
Like Franklin today.
Yeah. There is Kristen McCloskey is one of our senior directors. She just pointed back to Director DePass's question around cost. So there's also costs. There's and it just wasn't listed, like shipping.
So yeah, it's just not a $30 straight per pouch cost. So I don't know what is included in that quote, but I can pull up Grants and Beaumont's quote, and there's additional costs. Like there's an on-site implementation specialist that there's a charge for that they'll come out. There's the shipping cost. There's the additional pouches that might need to be ordered, and so they order some extras. So it wouldn't just be a straight $30 per student cost.
And I stand corrected. I did the math incorrectly. When you take the total amount that's listed and divide by the number of students, 23,000, it does come out to just over $30. It's $31.55.
Okay.
So it's close, and that probably includes that overhead cost.
Director Sullivan. Do you want me to read your statement? You're muted, which I feel really bad because I know that whatever you just said took a lot of effort.
Yeah, I just, what's going to be read does say, if you're off campus, you have your phone. And I kind of agree that it's not fair to say off campus unless everybody gets their phone at lunch. So anyway, that's in my statement. I wanted to change that. And also, the middle school kids would not need yonder pouches if they're putting them away at the first of the day and leaving them all day. They would just need the lock boxes. So that would be less of an expense, I would think. And everything else, I hope, is in my written statement because I can't speak.
So I'm going to take two things, I guess in somewhat of an orderly way. I'm going to start maybe with what I think is the easier piece, the suggestion that we remove the second bullet in 2E, and that staff provide in the staff memo a much more in depth of why they believe the first bullet actually covers that and what the range of discipline is in there. Because again, when I read this, to me, it doesn't seem to be as inclusive as you all think, but, so I think it needs to be fleshed out. So I'm wondering what the other committee members think of that, about removing that and having it explicitly.
Removing 2E.
2E, the second bullet. Because
Students-
staff is saying the first bullet actually covers that, and that there would include in the staff report what the sort of discipline would be if students violated this particular piece. Like, they took a picture with somebody without their permission and then used it to harass.
Yeah, and I would be okay removing that. It's also, would that be clarified in the, or is that in the anti-harassment policy then?
Yes, and
We
what
have
I'm
an
saying.
anti-harassing, and then we also have a cyberbullying policy, which speaks directly to the use of electronic devices to harass students.
Yeah, I would be okay removing that second bullet.
JJ?
I also just wanted to note that Director Wong needs to leave in just a couple of minutes, so.
Okay, so let me just finish off this one. JJ and Director Sullivan, you could do a, I don't know, Pat, okay, you're okay?
I'm in support of that as well.
Okay. So before Director Wong departs, he had a suggestion to be, and this was around the off and away, not being perhaps vague in some ways. And he had a suggestion around the, I'm going to try and pull it up.
I have it here if it makes it easier.
Oh, let me, because we're gonna do a little bit of a combination of what we currently, what I'm going to suggest is something, a little bit of a combination of his off and away and his description. I think this could be additive, because as he notes, this is more about where the device is, not like whether it's distracting or not. So I would suggest something like adding this language at the end of the 2A, or maybe we have definitions of off and away. But to add this sentence, devices must be off and stored in a way, and I can send this to you, stored in a way so the device cannot distract the student or other students or disrupt the learning environment. So it's eliminating it's identifying the distraction element of the phone, and also retaining the away portion. Director Wong, did I?
Yeah, after I speak, I have to go. But yeah, I changed the wording again, including school hours and on school campus, so that. Like,
yeah, we're gonna get to that. That's the time element. I want to first get to the off and away definition.
Like, for example, if you have your phone in your backpack and it's ringing all day and it's distracting your students, well, the current language is focusing on the device and its location, but not on its effect. And I think the reason I suggest this wording is because it's the effect that we are trying to, the damaging effect, of distraction that we're trying to mitigate. So by changing the language, the focus is on, implementing so that the district, the schools, the staff, everyone, teachers are focused on problem solving for the distraction of the devices, not just where the device happens to be stored away. So I think the reason for that is because then yeah, again, like I said, it's focusing on the negative impacts of smart technology, not just on its the physical location of it.
So I would note that if a device is off, it won't be ringing. But, and again, I'm trying to focus on that, because again, the when is a separate topic that we're going to get to, but this is more the definition of what we expect the state, I guess, the state of the phone or the device. So I'm just reading directly from your version, Director Wong. Devices, so this would be in addition to the current language, and then it would say, must be off and stored in ways that the device cannot distract the student or other students or disrupt the learning environment.
Sorry, I have to go right now, so good luck, have fun. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Bye, Eddie.
Does anybody object to adding, I mean, that's what it looks like.
Are you asking if the numbering's off? High schools off and away during school day except during a student's designated lunch. And then adding devices must be off and stored in a way so that the device cannot distract the student or other students or disrupt the learning environment.
I'm focusing on the definition really of off and away. And we're going to use the draft that was posted, which the full board has reviewed. It would be adding the language he added at 2A, and this is, again, getting into like what the device is doing is what he's trying to get at. Devices must be off and stored in ways that the device cannot distract the student or other students or disrupt the learning environment.
He also, I'm looking at his draft, but you're looking at the approved draft.
No,
Okay.
I'm reading his draft right here.
Okay.
But this is the draft we're working off of. So it would be taking his suggestion added to what off and away, the description. We're not talking about when or anything like that. We're talking about what the description of off and away is. So we'd be adding this to that we'd be adding his language, which is what we talked before the meeting. He said adding this language to the current draft's language would make the off and away less vague.
I would be in favor of adding that. I was just rereading our approved draft to see if we needed both. In other words, is his addition helpful? Because his full suggestion was to use his description instead of what we see in 2A.
Well, I actually think his description is makes it more vague. I mean, I think we're really clear. Like, here's what. Again, we're not talking about the time period. But what off and away, they're stored in a locker, backpack, purse, where the device is not on, visible, or in use. And what I feel like he's trying to add here is, and so it cannot distract the student or other students or disrupt the learning environment. To me, it's additive, not a replacement.
Not instead of. Oh, yeah, I'm in favor of adding it.
Just for clarity, does that mean students can't keep their phones in like their purses, backpacks, or like their pockets, or with?
They could.
Yeah. Then I'm in support of adding chair models.
And I should note that if a school principal decides to have something more restrictive, that's allowed. This is the
I do like
baseline.
that it's it says it's got to be stored in a locker, backpack, purse, pocket. It's got the list of kind of places it could be, as long as it's off.
Right. Not visible. So one of the things we talked about is, I know the students had talked about on your desk and face down, and so like that's not.
It's not
allowed.
adequate.
Patty, are you okay with adding that?
I really want them locked up, so no.
Pardon? You want it locked up?
I want them not in backpacks, not hiding away somewhere. I want them so the student can't get them.
I didn't hear a majority of the other board members say that. In fact, our off and away discussion as a full board was relatively short, like off and away seemed, I mean, I didn't hear anybody say locked up.
Well, just.
I did, though. I also was a fan of off and away all day without the nuance of
Well,
the
what she's saying
lunchtime.
is locked and away, not off and away.
Locked and away. I'm in favor of off and away. So I think Director Sullivan, what you're supportive of is even stricter than what I would be supportive of.
Yeah, because off and away is not working, so.
We
But
also don't have a
I agree,
district-wide policy.
With policy is policy, it's not. I guess I would like the policy to be stronger so that teachers have that and principals have that to support them.
So what I would suggest, Director Sullivan, is if you want to propose locked and away, like I say, there hasn't been any committee discussion about locked and away versus off and away, because, for example, the calculator caddies that some schools use, those are not locked. And it's not locked during lunchtime. And again, I'm trying to figure out where the center point is for the board and staff. I would like to address briefly an issue that Director Wong asked. He had suggested deleting G. However, this is a compliance with the statute, so it's not really a discretionary thing to add, or like we can't delete it. This was per our legal counsel's advice. So I want to address that. Patty, should we talk about two issues that you raised that are, you and I had talked about this, but that I suggested would be good topics. They're not really policy topics, but they're topics that could be brought before the board. And so unless you want to read it, I can read your version. I'm trying to find it now. Should I go ahead with the create a district-wide age-appropriate teaching guide which explains the research on the detrimental effects of cell phone use on young people? I've captured the general concept.
Yeah.
So instead of putting this in policy, what I had suggested is asking Chair Wong to, at a future board meeting, have staff come in and share what is currently in our curriculum. And so we can look at what the gaps are, if there are gaps, versus it's not really something you'd put in policy, but it's certainly a very topical item for discussion.
And we did see some of the curriculum early on that's delivered, I believe Jefferson and maybe a couple of other schools. Is that what you were?
Well, I think what Pat, and not to speak for you, Patty, but Patty's looking for is like, and not just at the high school, but do we have something that is integrated into, it could be in our SEL curriculum, but, and also age appropriate, because kids don't start using cell phones just in high school. And how that's integrated currently into any of our curriculum, and not just the use of cell phones, but I mean, obviously, social media,
Artificial intelligence.
Yeah. So actually, I think it's a great topic. We wouldn't put it in the policy.
Yeah, probably more administrative directive. But just to give the policy and tell everybody what they have to do without any explanation doesn't make sense. It just seems to me it has to be part of the whole to understand why we're doing this in the first place. But I know my understanding of the difference between administrative directives and policy is not total. So, and I guess we can't demand an administrative directive have that in it.
Yeah, and I don't think it actually would be an administrative directive either. I think this is very much part of, and Dr. Franco, I will defer to you if you want to speak to it, but I think it's part of like what it is that we share with our students internal of social emotional learning, appropriate use of devices, and certainly if we're giving everybody a Chromebook.
Yeah, no, I agree. It wouldn't be in any level of AD, but it does. And I would say this: I mean, the implementation of a district-wide cell phone policy will also mean we're calibrated in terms of not only enforcement, but then consequence. But I think the big piece is just education. I do know the Wayfinder curriculum, it has pieces of this. So we'll have to actually come together in seeing we need to be a little bit more comprehensive and more specific as we educate across the board. And yes, Director Brim-Edwards, it will be, if it's not, it's definitely an SEL component for sure.
Do you have a point of view?
I have a question regarding like the modes of like storage.
The what?
Storage. How the phones will be stored.
Yeah, let's. Can we close off one topic and then we'll get to that? So, Director Sullivan, if I send a request to Chair Wong about asking for a future presentation on this so that we can see what is currently being shared and taught students in an age-appropriate way as a starting point. Again, it's not a policy, but it's also adding that into the policy is not what we normally would do.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, at this point, I'm for any policy that gets cell phones out of here. So I'm not going to argue a lot on that point. I just want to make sure that we don't just throw the policy out there and say this is your cell phone policy without being sure we educate about it. Because if you can't buy into it, it's not going to work.
Right, and that would be implementation of what gets communicated to the principals, shared with staff, and also shared with families. And again, that is a staff function. My expectation. Other times when we've had a major policy rolled out, there has been a broader sharing than we do on, sort of a run-of-the-mill policy, or maybe the one doesn't have broad-based impacts. So that would be staff implementation. I don't know if either of you want to speak to that. Nope. Okay.
I don't think there's anything to add. I think the school leaders, the people who lead school leaders, and the education team who designs these difficult curriculum will help frame and educate, because that's what they do, and they're already doing it to some extent. I heard Dr. Franco say in the social emotional curriculum. So I don't think this isn't landing on a blank canvas.
Right.
This is in the context of lots of other issues, but as Dr. Franco said, I think they'll be very thoughtful in how that's rolled out, both from an operational perspective as well as an educational, curricular, and student support perspective across all those domains.
Okay, we'll get back to your other issue, Patty, in just a moment. JJ.
Yeah, but I think it was just regarding like the storage of phones. I know that's going to be on the staff side, but I just wanted to share some of the perspectives the district student council has shared and also students has shared in the survey. I know one of the things students shared in the survey that they're open to more flexible phone storages, more like caddies instead of yonder pouches. And I know the district student council also shared their support of having caddies than yonder pouches, because I think the thing we've seen and just heard from students and we just know what's happening is students are just finding ways out of yonder pouches, that may look like just putting, a burner phone in there. So I think that's why we are in support of having caddies instead of yonder pouches.
No, thanks for that.
I'll just add, just briefly, before the meeting, I had a conversation with Director Hollins, and he talked about what they saw in Vegas, which is a much cheaper and a very different version. It's sort of a desktop caddy that stays on the desk, that is definitely like off away, and it can't transmit anything. It's a lot cheaper, and it just stays on the desk. So it's similar to the sort of the in-classroom lockbox or the caddy, but this is actually just on the desk, and it just stays. And yes, students have their phone between passing period and lunchtime, but class time, they don't have it. So I think there's a lot of different options that potentially could address the sort of yonder versus everything else.
That's a tool that Yonder does not want us to know about.
Okay.
Did you want me to look into that?
Pardon?
Do you want me to look into that cost-wise, or?
But
do you know what it's called?
I would say the board's job is to say the what, and then it's staff's role to come back with a here's how we're going to effectively implement it.
Okay.
And also, generally, we don't make budget decisions in policy, because we make budget decisions as part of the budget process.
Right.
Which is another reason why we wouldn't be specific about a particular instrument or tool in a policy. So another issue that Director Sullivan raised, and if you want to say it, Patty, you can. I was going to raise the discipline issue. If you want to raise it, you can, or I can read what you sent me this morning.
You read it.
Okay. So this relates to the discipline. So rules specific for cell phone use should be put in the rights and responsibilities handbook. And we currently have a provision that says students who do not comply with the policy or the personal electronic device requirements of their school may be subject to discipline as outlined in the district's rights and responsibilities handbook, including having their personal electronic devices confiscated. So the draft policy already points to that.
Okay.
So I guess I would ask staff, what's the normal process for the rights and if there was going to be a change in the rights and responsibility handbook that would happen? It would it's not through policy. So
No.
tell you how it happens. I've been through it once in my
So
11 years.
Currently, there is guidance that says that each student should look to each school's cell phone policy, because different schools have different policies, levels of, prohibition. So there's guidance on that, and then
So that would be,
Oh, and so if it were, so that would change, because we could then add the district's cell phone policy. In addition to that, the OSSS team has been developing cell phone guidance, and once the board passes the cell phone policy, it will then incorporate that language into the guidance, and that will be included within the student responsibility and rights handbook.
So once we pass this, the Students' Rights and I'm just going to repeat it just to make sure I understand it. The Students' Rights and Responsibilities Handbook, which currently says students have to follow their own school's cell phone policy, it would be changed to say students are required to follow the district cell phone policy, and then there would be additional guidance created around the cell phone, district-wide cell phone policy that would be included in the Rights and Responsibility Handbook?
Correct.
Does that answer your question?
Yep.
Okay. Phew. Okay. So another change that was made between when we had the full board consensus and what I felt, not the consensus, I thought like this 4 to 7 group of people kind of nodding is the equitable supports. And because policies can't like dictate budget expenditures, and because we wouldn't want a policy to require an expenditure in years which maybe we don't have the resources, or for whatever reason, that this has been slightly modified to ensure that if, to the extent district provides resources to schools to implement, say it's for the, and again, I don't want to get in like which tool we might choose, whether it's a thing on the desk or the calculator caddy or whatever, that if there were a financial resource connected to that, that it would be provided equitably. Do I have that correct? So I just want to cover, that's slightly different worded than we had before. But just to be,
I'm trying to
be clear.
Tease apart the difference. So without the additions, it says the district shall equitably support schools to implement this policy.
I think the key addition is, and I don't know if you can read it on your version, but it's to the extent.
Yeah, I can see the red
because,
line. To the extent that the district provides financial resources to schools, it shall do so equitably. Yeah, I think it's.
Right.
I'm just trying to
So say that
I was trying to decide if what the additive was, and it was the extent to which.
Yeah, and it's making it more clear that say if we say we're gonna, for illustration, 200,000. We can't say we're gonna give 100,000 to one school to implement it, and all the rest of you will get the calculator caddies because they don't cost anything or they're very minimal. So that the ability to implement the policy with whatever resources we have will be equitable. Not equally, equitably.
Equitable. Yeah, I understand that. And I guess I thought it would be a given that those resources, but I should know better by now.
Okay. So, again, I'm going to go back to, we had a full board discussion. I feel like the key, and we solicited everybody's point of view on the core elements, and I feel like that's what was in the draft. We've made some revisions, and what I think we're down to, the most important pieces, I think the outstanding big piece, which is lunch and during passing time.
Yep.
Do you agree, Dr.?
Yes.
Okay. I believe I heard lunchtime, people were okay. okay with?
It would be a compromise on my part, and JJ and I had a discussion about this over the weekend. I said if you were to see something that felt threatening and you didn't have your phone on you, what would you do? In other words, when you're growing up, you have to be prepared to respond. The phone's not going to protect anybody from anything, but using your wits might. And so we had that discussion, but I feel like it's an equity issue my first inclination was to have an off and away all day, because I think that the cost of switching would be difficult in a 30-minute lunch period, logistically. But I also feel like it's an equity issue if some students are able to gain access to their phones because they can afford to eat lunch off campus or leave campus, and also to the point that you made about behaviors that would then sort of encourage people to leave campus so they could have their phones.
I mean, it's great that our kids, now we have free lunches for everybody.
Yeah.
And, from talking to
But it could be a disincentive, I guess, is what, to your point, to be able to use your phone if you leave. And, I don't know. I'm thinking about the food waste.
If you have your own car and you drive to work, you just leave, or you drive to school, you just leave your phone in the car, and you can go at lunchtime to use it. And
right, but that's a privilege that not
that's what
a
I'm
very
saying.
small amount of our student body probably have.
Well, it depends on what school you're at.
True.
My kids never had cars, but a lot of their friends did.
Yes, yeah.
JJ, do you want to speak to that? And then Patty?
Just the piece of the high school.
The lunchtime?
Yeah, I think I'm definitely in support of allowing students to have their phones during lunchtime, just as the things I brought up, the safety concerns. And I know just kind of adding on to like what Director DePass was saying, I know there can be some equity issues with students, who are able to afford and buy food off campus, but I know even, students who, get free lunches from school, sometimes they will eat it off campus, so that's definitely something that happens at schools.
Patty? You're on mute.
Practically on mute with them. I would prefer, off all day, but I won't win that one, I know. So I want a policy, so. I obviously would vote for it, even if they do have lunch on campus. Cell phones at lunch. And I definitely, even though I had gone along with what Eddie had said, it's definitely not fair if you can have it off campus, but not if you're on campus. So if you have it off campus, you have to have it on campus.
Thank you. So we've made a number of changes, and we can do two things. We've made a number of changes to the actual policy, and we have some other side issues, like what was described in the by Mary in the students' rights and responsibilities. I think like laying that out so that we all understand how that's going to connect. And then also the request to Director Wong to better understand what we currently have in our curriculum and where there are gaps, if any. So we have that, and we have some changes. We can send this to the full board, either with a recommendation of this draft for first reading, or we could send it to the full board with a recommendation that we have a first reading and a discussion. And the advantage of moving it out of committee is there was earlier this summer discussion about trying to have something in place by the next semester. The longer we keep things in committee, we still will have a first reading, 21 days, and then a second reading. my preference is that we recommend this to the board for first reading, and
As amended?
with the
Or
amendments
with-
we talked about
okay.
today. And I feel like the one place that we just need to get the collective down in the public meeting, down the dais, is if people want to maintain the lunch or no lunch. And that we could do that at the first reading, and that actually wouldn't delay it, because we wouldn't have started the 21-day clock yet. But it also would allow everyone, again, I feel, I definitely got the message that all board members wanted to weigh in. But that way we could send this draft out, which, again, I believe reflects the core elements that the majority of the board were like, yes, with right now the exception being the sort of lunch period. And we'll send it this way. And if there's a majority that are like, no, we don't think it should be lunchtime. And of course, we'll want the students to weigh in, and the superintendent can, and staff can present a point of view, but then we can, I think it's a relatively, if we changed it, it would be, a relatively simple change at the time, and we could still get the first reading going, but I think that way we get this moving. Because I think we could talk about it all year.
I would be supportive of that. Yeah, I would be supportive of that. And I remember this summer, there was a desire to get this before the school year, and then, which was 3 weeks away or something. And then the second best was to get it in the second semester, which would be we're coming up on. And I think that to give the whole board one thing to really discuss, but not 4 things, is helpful. I'd be supportive of getting it out of committee.
Okay. Well, I do think the draft that we had today I went back and watched the meeting, and the majority of the board members gave me their core elements, and I do think this reflects it. And there is a fundamental, I guess, lunchtime or non-class time. I think there was vigorous agreement around, no class time, with very few exceptions. And, but this other piece, so we can reaffirm it or change it at the full board meeting. Are you okay with that, Patty? Okay. Can we send it with a recommendation for a first reading and a discussion about the lunchtime with that
In our
addition?
December 3rd?
Whatever time we can get the first on.
Sure.
I do have some questions for Section 2B, just kind of like those additional restrictions that may be adopted by the school, meaning like the principal. And so I was wondering for the piece, regarding like the lunch, if we allow students to have their phones during lunch, does that mean an administrator would be allowed to kind of take away that?
Correct. Where are you talking about individually confiscating a phone?
Or I'm just talking about, like, say if we have the policy that high school students, when they eat off campus, they're allowed to have their phones. There's a section that says that the adopted restrictions additional restrictions may be adopted by school. That means the administrator can change that?
Yep.
Okay. I would just like to have more of a discussion when we discuss that more with the full board.
Okay. Okay. Do you feel like you have a clear sense of?
There hasn't been discussion of passing time that was in the staff memo, and I don't know if that needs to be surfaced or we've moved on, but I just note that that's kind of a hanging chad on the open issues.
I can say, look, I think we should send the policy out, and we can include, if people feel strongly about having a conversation about passing time, we can.
Yeah, I think that's when we've heard is the behavior happens that we want to discourage. So I guess depending on what we're solving for, if we're solving for, teachers not having the time to manage, then the policy takes care of that, but the passing time is still outstanding.
Yeah, and I would definitely be open to having a discussion about the passing time, and I think if staff could present more of their perspectives on that, that would be really helpful.
Yeah. Well, the current policy has off and away during passing time. again, it's only whatever, 5 minutes, 4 minutes, depending on 6 minutes.
Yeah. Longest is 6.
It's like 4 to 6 minutes. Okay. Two things, and I'm going to say just because of the time, and I want to be did committee members have an opportunity to look at the proposed rescission that staff recommended? And if people haven't or want to have a discussion, I think we should move it to the next meeting agenda.
I'd like to move it to the next one,
Okay, we can do that.
just time-wise.
So I would just ask everybody to take a look at it. Staff is recommending that we rescind this, and the process we have is, it's just like the reverse of adopting a policy to unadopt it. Essentially, we make a recommendation to the board. There's a first reading about essentially removing it from the policy. There's 21 days, and then we adopt it, and then it's actually removed from our policy manual. So come prepared to have a point of view about that the next meeting. And then,
Sorry, Chairperson Edwards, Chairperson, what date would that be, the next meeting, when we will discuss the phone policy?
whenever the next policy committee meeting is, on it.
The next meeting is December 2nd.
Okay. And the last item is, I brought we have a board ethics and conflict of interest policy that was adopted last year, and this was the second in a suite of ethics policies. The first one was around nepotism. And so we adopted this last year. I have a proposed addition that has been posted, and Director Hollins has asked a series of questions, so we're going to have answers to those questions, and also sort of the rationale, and also sharing what some other jurisdictions do in terms of sort of the revolving door and sort of undue influence, given that board members have oversight and responsibilities at the district over both budget and also the superintendent, that there are reasons for having some distance between when a board member is actually on the board and if they take employment with the district. In addition, we have had some questions that we can also discuss at the next meeting around whether that's like central office or something, that a position that somebody previously held, say in a school, and whether that would be a different category. Pardon?
Less than 365 days. I'd love to have a discussion about it. I wasn't sure what we were trying to solve with this.
Yeah, well, it's essentially.
So it's hard without a concrete
so
example.
Like board members currently have oversight, and they also evaluate the superintendent, who would be, in theory, and there have been times when the superintendent has hired immediately after a board member has left a board member for a position and raised questions about the credibility and the ethics for the district for doing that, and whether there was undue influence by the board member on the superintendent for the hiring of the position. And again, it's not an unusual thing that there be some distance.
Some separation.
But we'll have, so.
We'll wait to get those responses to Gary's, Director Hollins' questions.
Anything else for the good of the order? All right. Director Sullivan, anything? Okay, great. Thank you for all the good work.